Welcome to Mysteries and Crime, where we uncover the darkest corners of true crime. Tonight, we dive into the terrifying case of Jeffrey Dahmer, a man whose crimes shook the world. But here's the question for you. What critical mistake led to Dahmer's eventual capture? Drop your answer in the comments below. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer took the lives of 17 men and boys. His crimes ranged from gruesome murders to necrophilia and cannibalism. Operating mainly in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer's horrifying spree went unnoticed for years, until one fateful night when a desperate escape exposed his dark secrets. It was a hot July night in 1991 when a man named Tracy Edwards ran through the streets of Milwaukee, his wrists still bound in handcuffs, frantic, terrified, desperate for help. He stopped two police officers and led them to the Oxford Apartments, Dahmer's lair of horrors. Inside, officers expected a domestic disturbance, but what they found was beyond comprehension. A rotting stench filled the air. The walls were lined with disturbing Polaroids, graphic images of dismembered bodies taken in various stages of mutilation. In the refrigerator, a human head, and in the freezer, more body parts, preserved like a grotesque collection. Further searching revealed skulls, bleached bones, and a 55-gallon drum containing decomposing remains. It was clear. This was no ordinary crime scene. This was a chamber of horrors. Within hours, Jeffrey Dahmer was in custody. His arrest would unveil the full extent of his monstrous acts, leaving even seasoned detectives shaken. But how had he managed to go undetected for so long? And what led to his disturbing urges? Stay with us as we dive deeper into the minds of both the victims and the predator who hunted them. Jeffrey Dahmer's victims were primarily young men and boys, often targeted due to their vulnerability, economic struggles, or social isolation. They ranged in age from 14 to 31 years old, many from marginalized communities. One of the most haunting cases was Konorak Sinthasomphone, a 14-year-old Laotian boy. In May of 1991, Konorak escaped Dahmer's apartment, bruised, bleeding, and disoriented, only to be returned to his killer by Milwaukee police officers. Dahmer convinced them that the boy was his intoxicated boyfriend. Hours later, Konorak was dead. Anthony Sears, an aspiring model, was another victim. In 1989, he met Dahmer at a bar, unaware of the deadly fate awaiting him. Sears' body was later discovered in Dahmer's apartment, his head and genitals preserved as trophies. Stephen Hicks, Dahmer's first victim, was killed in 1978. After inviting Hicks to his home for drinks, Dahmer bludgeoned and strangled him. This marked the beginning of a killing spree that would span 13 years. Each victim had a story, a future stolen. Yet for years, their disappearances went unnoticed or dismissed. Society's neglect and systemic failures played a disturbing role in allowing Dahmer to continue. Born on May 21, 1960, Jeffrey Dahmer grew up in Bath, Ohio. His childhood was marked by early signs of psychopathy, a fascination with dead animals, isolation, and an increasing desire to control others. As a teenager, Dahmer was an outcast, indulging in alcoholism and violent fantasies. But it wasn't until after high school that he took his first life. The murder of Stephen Hicks gave him what he later described as a sense of total control. His modus operandi was chillingly methodical. Dahmer would lure victims to his apartment under the pretense of photography, companionship, or money. Once inside, he drugged them, strangled them, and then performed disturbing post-mortem acts, including cannibalism and attempting to create zombies by injecting acid into their brains. Dahmer wasn't motivated by rage like many serial killers. Instead, his desire was control, an obsessive need to possess his victims completely. He later admitted that he didn't kill out of hatred, but out of a compulsive need to keep his victims with him forever. Yet despite multiple close calls, Dahmer avoided capture for 13 years. Even after being arrested for molesting a minor, he was released early, giving him more time to kill. His eventual downfall wasn't due to an elaborate police operation, but rather the sheer determination of one survivor. Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree was not a single moment of madness. It was a prolonged descent into darkness that spanned over 13 years, from 1978 to 1991. His methods were as chilling as they were methodical, and his victims never saw it coming. A killer's routine. Dahmer's approach was disturbingly consistent. He lured men from bars, bus stops, or shopping malls, offering money, alcohol, or companionship. Once inside his apartment, he would serve drinks laced with sedatives, waiting for them to slip into unconsciousness. Then, he would strangle or suffocate them before dismembering their bodies in what he later described as a ritual. But murder alone wasn't enough. Dahmer sought complete control. He experimented with horrific zombification techniques, injecting acid or boiling water into his victims' skulls in a desperate attempt to create living, submissive dolls. None survived. The Oxford Apartments, House of Horrors, Dahmer's home, apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, became a chamber of unspeakable atrocities. When police finally entered, they uncovered severed heads stored in the freezer, human hearts and organs in the refrigerator, a large drum filled with decomposing body parts, Polaroid photos showing his victims at various stages of dismemberment. The smell was overpowering, decay mixed with cleaning chemicals, an unmistakable stench of death. Even hardened investigators struggled to process the horrors before them. The brutality of his crimes. Dahmer didn't just kill, he prolonged suffering, desecrated bodies, and kept trophies. He later admitted to cannibalism, consuming flesh, hearts, and organs to feel closer to his victims. Among the most disturbing cases was Errol Lindsay, a 19-year-old. Dahmer drugged him, drilled a hole into his skull, and poured acid inside, attempting to keep him alive in a vegetative state. When the experiment failed, he strangled him and dismembered the body. Another horrifying case was Matt Turner, who met Dahmer in 1991 at a Chicago bus station. Turner, just 20 years old, was lured back to Milwaukee, where he was strangled and dismembered. His severed head was later found in Dahmer's freezer. Dahmer almost got caught multiple times. In 1988, police arrested him for molesting a 13-year-old boy, but he was sentenced to only 1 year in a work release program. He was released early. Then came Konorak Synthasamphone, the 14-year-old who escaped in May 1991. He was found naked and bleeding, but when police arrived, Dahmer convinced them it was just a lover's quarrel. They returned the boy to Dahmer, unknowingly sending him to his death. Finally, in July 1991, Tracy Edwards outsmarted Dahmer. He fought back, escaped, and flagged down police. When they entered the apartment, the nightmare was finally exposed. But how did Dahmer evade capture for so long? For more than a decade, Jeffrey Dahmer operated under the radar. slipping through law enforcement's grasp multiple times. His ability to blend into society and manipulate authority figures allowed his killing spree to continue far longer than it should have. Despite numerous missing person reports, the police never connected the dots. Many of his victims were from marginalized communities, leading to delays in investigations. Several times, Dahmer was questioned by police and let go, even when red flags were glaring. However, July 22, 1991, changed everything. Tracy Edwards' escape forced police into Dahmer's apartment, where they discovered a trove of nightmarish evidence, photographs, body parts, preserved organs. The truth was undeniable. After 2 hours of interrogation, Dahmer confessed in chilling detail, describing his crimes without remorse. The police had finally stopped a monster, but the real question remained: how had he gotten away with it for so long? The crime scene at Oxford Apartments was unlike anything forensic experts had ever encountered. Investigators faced the gruesome task of identifying body parts, but Dahmer's methods made it difficult. Many remains were dismembered beyond recognition. Some body parts had been dissolved in acid. Others were preserved in refrigerators and freezers. DNA evidence was still in its infancy in the early 1990s, making identification slow and difficult. Forensic pathologists worked tirelessly to match remains to missing persons reports, but some victims were never conclusively identified. Had modern forensic advancements, like rapid DNA analysis and digital tracking, been available, authorities may have caught Dahmer sooner. His calculated efforts to cover his tracks had worked for years, until fate and one man's determination to survive brought his empire of horror crashing down. The revelation of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes sent shockwaves through Milwaukee and beyond. Neighbors who had once dismissed the strange smells and noises in his apartment were now confronted with the horrifying truth. A serial killer had lived among them. The LGBTQ+ community, particularly men of color, expressed outrage, feeling that police neglect had allowed Dahmer to operate unchecked. The city was gripped by fear, and for months, paranoia lingered. Even after his arrest, Dahmer's presence loomed large. His crimes raised uncomfortable questions about race, law enforcement bias, and how so many warning signs had been ignored. Some even protested outside the police department, demanding accountability. The media frenzy surrounding Dahmer's arrest was unprecedented. Newspapers and television networks sensationalized the gruesome details, dubbing him the Milwaukee Cannibal. Interviews with victims' families painted a picture of lives stolen and justice delayed. News outlets focused on Dahmer's calm demeanor, his twisted confessions, and the systemic failures that let him escape capture for so long. Talk shows debated the psychology of serial killers, while crime documentaries dissected his disturbing methods. Even decades later, Dahmer remains one of the most infamous names in true crime history. His story, a grim warning of evil hidden in plain sight. Despite Dahmer's full confession, many questions and theories persist. Some believe he could have been caught much sooner if authorities had taken earlier complaints seriously. The botched response to Conorak Synthesomphone, where police returned the 14-year-old to Dahmer's apartment, remains one of the most egregious missteps in law enforcement history. Others wonder, were there more victims? Dahmer claimed he had killed 17 people, but investigators speculated that the true number could be higher. Unidentified remains were found in his apartment, and his transient lifestyle before moving to Milwaukee meant he had opportunities to kill elsewhere. Another disturbing theory: Dahmer wanted to be caught. He left incriminating evidence in plain sight, stopped hiding body parts, and had become increasingly careless in his final months. Some criminologists believe that deep down, he knew his reign of terror was nearing its end. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began in January of 1992 and lasted 2 weeks. Though he pleaded guilty, but insane, the jury found him legally sane at the time of his crimes. He was convicted of 15 counts of murder and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 957 years in prison. He showed little emotion in court, only apologizing to the victims' families. But justice was short-lived. In November of 1994, Dahmer was murdered in prison by Christopher Scarver, another inmate. Scarver later claimed that Dahmer taunted other prisoners, even fashioning body parts out of prison food. His death closed the chapter on one of the most horrifying criminal cases in American history, but the scars of his crimes still linger today. Even after Jeffrey Dahmer's death in 1994, many unanswered questions remain. Did he have more victims that were never identified? Could earlier intervention have saved lives? And what truly drove his obsession with control and domination? One thing is certain, Dahmer was not just a killer, but a disturbing anomaly in criminal history. His methods were uniquely calculated, his ability to evade suspicion baffling. Despite his confessions, there are layers of this case that remain unsettlingly unclear, and that brings us back to our question for you. What critical mistake led to Dahmer's eventual capture? Let us know in the comments below. The Milwaukee Cannibal case changed the city and the world forever. It exposed law enforcement failures, fueled discussions on race, class, and LGBTQ+ safety, and influenced laws regarding parole and early release. The Oxford apartments were demolished as Milwaukee tried to erase the stain of horror left behind. But the victims' families could never forget. Today, the Dahmer case remains one of the most studied in criminal psychology. His crimes continue to serve as a grim reminder of evil hidden in plain sight. Thank you for joining us on Mysteries and Crime. Did you find tonight's hidden clue? What critical mistake led to Dahmer's eventual capture? Drop your answer in the comments below, and we'll announce the winner in our next episode. Remember, the truth is rarely straightforward. Keep questioning, keep theorizing, and as always, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe.